Hello and welcome back to Azure Terraformer. We got another Leap Mentor session for you. This time we're going to double click on Swagger and the Open API specification, and we're going to explain from a pretty high level how it works within an ASP.NET project, and then how developers can develop client libraries using code gen tools that are pointed at the Swagger endpoint. Remember, this is totally off the cuff, me fielding random questions from my Leap intern, and just kind of going with the flow. So I hope you're up for that. If you are, let's get started.
So in our ASP.NET code base, just to double click on this, in our ASP.NET code base, we don't need Swagger, first of all, to build an ASP.NET REST API. Swagger is like an add-on that you include. There's a NuGet package, right, that you include to add this Swagger generator to your ASP.NET project. And then there's places in the startup code that you enable Swagger to go do its magic. And so Swagger generator is basically going to build in an additional endpoint. Like there's like an endpoint within the ASP.NET project. I've got my controllers that I've implemented. They get hosted on the site that I deploy. So when I deploy my ASP.NET project, I have like my REST API that's been deployed, and it's going to be at, let's say, http://localhost 523738. I'm just making this up. So I've got my ASP.NET project. This is my code base. I essentially build and publish to a web server, and that hosts a website with my code on it. And my code is stored, like I have these controllers, and my controllers have get, post, put, whatever, at my endpoints. But the Swagger endpoint is like a special, like, it's like, I don't know, I forget what endpoint it's, but it's like you go to Swagger, and it's like v1.docs, I think. So it create, basically the most important thing is that it creates some magical endpoint. At this endpoint, it's got the Open API specification, and that's in JSON. And then it has another endpoint, which is optional, totally optional. You can have a Swagger UI endpoint, and then with this, the Swagger UI endpoint is hosted here, and this is where you've got like the Swagger UI, I guess, GUI, that somebody can go use. So now the Swagger UI is where like a human developer, definitely a developer, not like, an average citizen. A developer is going to go to the Swagger UI, and they can interact with it to test out, they can, read as documentation. Or they can, like the Swagger UI could actually be functional, or, test it out. But the Swagger UI doesn't have to be functional. The Swagger, in order for it to be functional, it actually has to be pointed at like API, my app. The Swagger UI actually has to be pointed at a fully working version of my application. So you can change where you point Swagger UI at just by changing the endpoint or the URL, the base URL of the REST API. So if I have a production version of my REST API that's hosted, so I've pushed and deployed it out to www.marktinderholt.com. The same code I built and published out to this actual website hosted on, let's say, on Azure. I can point my Swagger UI at this endpoint. As long as it's using the same code base, I can test it out against the production version of my app, of my code deployed at marktinderholt.com. Or as a developer working locally, I can build my project. I can publish it to my local machine at a local host endpoint, and then have Swagger UI point to my local environment, which probably is going to have different versions of my API. And then I can test out my code. That's pretty much the function of it. This JSON specification, this is where, as a developer, I might use like a client code generator, and the client code generator is going to go look at this JSON documentation that's published at this address, and it's going to generate like let's say a Java convenience SDK for my REST API. And then this SDK is going to allow me to build a Java client application that uses my REST API. So this human developer is going to code this client application in Java. The client application in Java is going to use this convenience SDK to talk to my application, right? And so the SDK is actually going to do that. Yeah, okay. So Python. So we'll say Python client application. So inside my Python client application, I'm going to do like an import my REST API. Does it have a semicolon? No, it's just import my REST API. So inside my Python app, I'm going to import this library, this Python library that gets generated using like a code generation tool like Swagger CodeGen.exe. It's some other program. So this program is used by the developer to generate this library, Python library, from this JSON file. This JSON file describes what my REST API can do. The Swagger CodeGen program looks at the JSON file, and the developer tells Swagger CodeGen, hey, I want you to use this JSON file, and I want you to generate a Python code library. That produces this thing right here. And then now the Python developer is like, oh, okay, in my Python application, I'm going to import this library. And now using this library, I can use Python. And then in Python, I don't have to be like HTTP client, dot post, blah, 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 blah. I don't know how you do it in Python, but it's probably similar to that. Post async, or I don't know. So that's Swagger. It's kind of how the client, this is all client side stuff, right? And then this is all like server side stuff. It's how a client can talk to the server side stuff. And on the server side stuff, it's all REST APIs and stuff. So this area here in the middle, this is kind of like the glue, so to speak, connects the client to the server.